Addition and subtraction. When we have significant figures, as we do various math problems, it will change how many significant figures our answer can have. Well, we've done multiplication and division. Addition and subtraction has its own set of rules. In addition and subtraction is not the number of sig figs that matters, but it is the location of them relative to the decimal. So if I have 10.35 and I add 9.7. Well, if we normally add this up, 5, 10, we would see 20.05. Question is, what value do I actually get to report? Just because I can add this up in my calculator and get 20.05 doesn't mean I can report that value. We need to think about sig figs. Well, if we look at the numbers, I've got one that has 4 sig figs, and I have one that has 2 sig figs. However, that's not what's important. We needed to identify the sig figs because the changes that happen when we add and subtract are based on position. So for both of these, find whichever significant figure is the farthest to the right in the number. Since we have decimal, they're past the decimal. For our first value, that's the 5. It is 2 spots past the decimal. For our 9.7, that is the 7. It is 1 spot past the decimal. When we then add them together, I get to keep whichever was the least farthest to the right. So the 7 went the least to the right of my 2 endpoints. I get to keep from that spot forward. And they're all considered significant. So this becomes 20 point, and I can round the remainder. That 5 would round up, so this 0 becomes a 1. When I add these two values together, what I end up with is actually a value that has 3 sig figs. Because it doesn't matter what the original number of significant figures were when you add and subtract. It matters what that last position was. Because whichever of those last positions was the least to the right, you get to keep that position and everything to the left in your final answer. Another example for that, let's do 10,930 minus 212. If we were to do sig figs, I've got 4 sig figs on top, I've got 3 on bottom. When I subtract these, you'll get 8, 2 and 1 is 1, 9 and 2 is 7. We go down to 10,718. The question is, well, where were my last sig figs? The 2, which is in the 1's position, and the 3, which was in the 10's position. The least farthest to the right is that 3. And so I get to keep that spot and everything in front of it. So I get to say, oh yeah, it's 10,700. Well, I can look at the 8 and say, well, that's over a 5, so it'll round up. The 1 becomes a 2, and the 8 is a 0. It is now just a space holder. Don't forget, don't drop it. A lot of folks occasionally will just leave that spot out, but that makes our 10,000 down to only 1,000. And so you definitely need to keep the 10,000, 10,000 by putting zeros in after our last sig fig. And, well, by coincidence, we end up with 4 sig figs in this final answer. But it's not dependent on the original number of sig figs. It is dependent on the locations of the most to the right sig fig in each number.